There was nothing that appeared out of the ordinary about my father's house, other than the fact that it didn't have an address. None of the houses on that street did. The people who lived on that block all had to make do and get their mail from a P.O. box in town. I was surprised to learn that this was rare but not unheard of. Not every road in the United States has a name. There are some roads less traveled, even in the age of Google Maps. My father moved into this house about 10 years ago. It had belonged to his then wife, and I hadn't heard much from him since. Which wasn't out of the ordinary since we didn't speak often. It wasn't scorched earth, but we were never close. My mother died shortly after I was born, so it had always been just the two of us. But he was solitary by nature, and the older I got, the less we had to talk about until eventually we became two strangers. Nothing in common besides our DNA. I heard of my father's passing through his attorney. It was a call from an unknown number telling me that my father had left me this unmarked house on an unnamed road. Bad news. Your father is dead. Good. News you're a homeowner. I had never stepped foot on the property. To be honest, I never imagined myself moving out of the city, but as a family man, you do what you have to do to survive. My wife and I just had a baby girl. We had been looking for a house in our neighborhood, but the prices were bad and the school districts were worse. The timing of this phone call and the news about this house seemed serendipitous. Lucky. Even. A couple of years ago, transplanting our lives and moving to the sticks would have been unthinkable, but things were different now. My job became entirely remote. My wife had taken a career pause after having our daughter. Starting over, in a 4-bedroom house on a tree-lined street seemed doable, even if it was in the middle of nowhere. We agreed that we'd drive down and check it out. We took a look at the house and hired an inspector to make sure there wasn't anything suspect about the property. Everything was in fine working condition, and aside from a small leak in the roof, the house was holding up well for its age. It was a handsome craftsman, charming and down-to-earth. Sure, we could have put it on the market and gotten a condo in the city with whatever cash we could have sold it for. But my wife fell in love with the place upon arrival. Something about the house and the street felt timeless, like something you'd see on a postcard. And that was that. Within a matter of days, we left our apartment and uprooted our lives to move into our new home. I didn't have a lot of friends back in the city. Everyone moved across the country in the first years of the pandemic. Catherine and Zoe, my wife and daughter, were my whole world, or at least most of my world. The rest of it was on the internet, so the transition wasn't as bad as I feared. As we were moving in, one of our neighbors stopped by to introduce himself. His name was Malcolm. He was a warm and old-fashioned man. His wife Barbara came by minutes later with a casserole. They looked like they walked out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Friendly neighbors, I thought to myself, like you see in the movies. In the city, we had lived in the same building for almost 10 years and knew nobody else in it besides the person who lived above us, who I only spoke to with open hostility. Now, at least we knew two friendly faces. Malcolm asked about my father, and if he told me anything about this house or this neighborhood, to which I said zilch. Malcolm smiled. Well, one of the quirks of not having an address is that people from town can never seem to find it. Repairmen, delivery men, you name it. Malcolm added that he used to work as a handyman, and he offered his services if anything ever needed attention. A casserole and a friendly repairman? Not bad for day one. Catherine and I were still unpacking, so the meeting was warm but brief. On their way out, Malcolm turned to me and asked another question. His tone of voice shifted this time. Have you seen anyone unexpected walking by? Unexpected? I'm not sure what you mean. Malcolm paused for a moment. This street is a special place. We get a lot of folks passing through, he said before digging one of his business cards out of his wallet. Call me once you see your first passerby. And with that, they were gone. Everything else about Malcolm was so straightforward and no-nonsense that this comment really stuck out to me. His countenance became so strange. What the hell was he talking about? I asked Catherine what she thought he meant, and she believed it was crystal clear. Unexpected passerbys. He probably saw a person of color and freaked out, or someone homeless. That's what we get for moving to the country. The bigger the houses, the smaller the minds. I couldn't help but smile. Catherine was such a spitfire. I usually kept things bottled in, and Catherine was a fire hose. I reminded her that she was the one that fell in love with this place, and we probably shouldn't assume our neighbors are bigots on day one. Before she could convince me that I was wrong, Zoe woke up crying and the conversation slipped away. We ate their casserole that night. It was incredible. I thought about Malcolm's parting words as I lay in bed that night, holding them in my mind until I finally drifted off to sleep. The first time it happened was about a week later. I was taking out the trash when I saw someone walking by who was, in a word, familiar. He was tall and slender, wearing a long-brimmed hat and some kind of coat. My mind froze. When a computer is asked to do something beyond its processing capability, you'll see that colored spinning pinwheel. You know what I'm talking about. The pinwheel of death. Well, my brain basically did that. It pinwheeled. Who is this person? Where do I know him from? Is he a man from my past? Is he a celebrity? Someone from my dreams or nightmares? After what felt like forever, it finally clicked. "Mr. Williams," I said with a shout. It was one of my high school teachers. He turned and recognized me immediately. Christ, this man had aged well. I asked him what he was doing here, and he said he was visiting someone down the way. As soon as my brain figured out who he was, I was flooded with 100 feelings and memories. The effect was immediate and sensory. I couldn't explain it. It felt like taking a shot of alcohol at 8 o'clock in the morning. Wowza. Mr. Williams was a strange and singular man. He wasn't the most popular teacher. There were all sorts of rumors about his personal life, but I loved him. He was the first teacher that made numbers seem approachable and even fun. And as someone who now writes computer code for a living, I don't know if I would be where I am if it wasn't for him. I should have told him this, the effect he had on me. But I was so surprised by the encounter and the headspace that it put me in that he was gone before I had the chance to collect myself. I went in to tell Catherine. You'll never believe who I just saw. Catherine and I went to the same high school, but were in totally separate friend groups. I didn't know her in school at all, and we only really got to know each other at our 5-year reunion. But she would know exactly who Mr. Williams was and how random it was to see him crossing our street. After I finished telling her the story, she looked confused. I could have sworn he died. It was in the newsletter. No, that was the old physics teacher. Mr. Williams is alive, and let me tell you, that man has not aged a day. Maybe he's a vegan. Catherine shrugged, saying what a small world it was, and that was that. Later that evening, after Zoe was down, I went on my computer to try and find Mr. Williams on Facebook. I should have told him how much his classes inspired me. I should have told him back then, I should have told him earlier today, but at the very least I could add him and drop him a message. After a minute I found his profile, and my brain became the spinning pinwheel once again. I knew what I was seeing, but it was beyond my processing capability. 6 years prior, Mr. Williams had a seizure while driving and drove off an overpass. When you're living with a newborn, life becomes a blur. With the recent move and the lack of sleep, I quickly realized that I had experienced a waking dream. One time in college, I was so sleep-deprived that I saw someone who wasn't there. Surely that's what this was. That's what this had to be. I put the encounter out of my mind and refused to think of it anymore. A couple of days later, I was doing laundry when I found a soaked and waterlogged business card in the washer. It was from Malcolm. His parting words once again came into focus. Call me once you see your first passerby. Based on the cut of his hair and the size of his truck, I had believed Catherine's take on this comment, that this was an old man grumbling about neighbors that made him uncomfortable. But I had seen someone who couldn't have been there. Perhaps he had seen someone as well. The card was wet and pulpy, but his number was still legible. My hands were shaking as I dialed him. He picked up quickly, and after introducing myself, got straight to the point. Who'd you see? I stepped into the backyard, out of Catherine's earshot. I told him everything. My encounter with Mr. Williams, a man who had long been dead, how I spoke to him and how he looked exactly like he did 20 years ago. I felt a low-grade panic saying this all out loud. This was fucking insane. As I rambled on, the spinning pinwheel of my brain hummed, at a fever pitch. When Malcolm got the sense that I was done, he spoke plainly, calmly even. He told me to sit down, so I did. He took a deep breath and told me to listen very carefully. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible. I apologize that I didn't warn you what you were in for here. But if I had, you wouldn't have listened to me anyway. I needed you to see for yourself. This is a very, very special place. He took another breath. Between words, I could hear my own heart pounding. You can see people from the past here. Nobody knows why, but sure as the day follows the night, for some reason people from your past stroll down the street like they're just going about their lives. It isn't always dead people, although those are the ones that will really cook your goose. You still hearing me, son? All I could manage was a grunt. Good. Now my wife and I have lived here a long time. We've come to love it, as I'm sure you will too. But just to save you some trouble, I wanted to let you know a few things we've learned to make the transition easier. Are you still in a place where you can hear these things? I grunted again. Okay, well, first off, these people never come inside. They insist they have somewhere to go, and if you get too pushy, they just leave. We learned that the hard way. Likewise, you can't seem to follow them for long. You can tail them for a block or two, but within the blink of an eye, poof, they up and vanish. That took us a long time to accept. Being as old as we are, there are some people you don't want to let go of. Trying to chase them is more pain than it's worth. Do you understand what I'm saying? He paused for a moment, as if that part was more important than the rest. Yeah. The other thing is that when you see these people, they're not omnipotent. It's not like they're in heaven or something, you know? Your high school teacher wasn't talking to the you from today. He was talking to the you from high school, you understand? I did. Perhaps that's why my conversation with Mr. Williams was so curt. Malcolm went on. The interesting thing here is that it can really be anyone. You have no say in it. As long as it's someone you have memories of, you really might see them strolling down the street. I'm sure you're still taking this in. But I promise you, once you get used to it, it becomes just a little quirk. Now I bet I know exactly what you're thinking. There's no way in the world you know what I'm thinking. He laughed. You're thinking, am I going to tell my wife or wait for her to see for herself? I paused. That wasn't what I was thinking, but it's sure as shit what I was thinking about now. Malcolm told me to call him whenever. He kept repeating the word special, so I ended the conversation as quickly as I could. I felt insane. I could hear my baby crying in the house and Catherine doing her best to comfort her. But I wasn't ready to go inside yet. My head was still spinning. I needed to take a walk. I hadn't smoked in several years, but after that phone call I walked down to the corner store and had a cigarette. As I took a drag on an American Spirit, I decided I wasn't going to tell Catherine because I didn't think any of this was real. I had no idea what was happening, but it sure as hell wasn't this window to the past bullshit that Malcolm described. I am a coder and computer programmer, and while I know that there's more to life than ones and zeros, there's a certain straightforwardness to computer binary that I've always found comforting. Things either are or aren't. People are dead or alive. They're with you, or they're gone. I don't see any in between there. I remember reading a story online about this guy who started seeing all sorts of crazy shit in his apartment. Sticky notes that had been left in the night by mystery intruders, fire ants appearing and disappearing in impossible places. He lived in a windowless apartment with concrete walls, so he didn't know how any person or insect could be sneaking in. He started asking for help on an online forum about what rights he had to break his lease and whatnot. After a stream of crackpot theories and suggestions, someone on the forum suggested he get his carbon monoxide detector checked since he was in a windowless room. Sure enough, the detector was busted, and this guy had been inhaling so much carbon monoxide that he started tripping balls. It was a miracle he didn't die. It was all in his head. But I thought of that story as I stomped out my cigarette. There's an answer. There's always an answer. I spent the next 2 weeks hiring every inspector and public health agency I could to come check out the street. Surely it couldn't be carbon monoxide if it was all happening outdoors, but there had to be a natural gas leak or something in the water supply. Like Malcolm mentioned, it was hell to get anyone to come out to the place with the lack of addresses and all. But eventually they made their way, and one by one they gave the house, the yard, and the street a clean bill of health. I heard footsteps. Behind me, the slap of Catherine's favorite flip-flops, and saw that she had come outside. She heard some of the commotion and asked what was going on. I made up some lie about wanting to make sure everything was safe for Zoe, which was half true, because at this point I was convinced there was some massive gas leak going on here. It had to be something like that. Catherine looked confused but was too tired to question it any further. As the last of the inspectors was packing up, I saw a 10-year-old boy on the other side of the street. One glance confirmed who he was. I froze in my tracks. His name was Caleb, my closest friend from ages 0 to 12, the kind of friend you have when you're that age and never again. But there he was, wearing this dorky orange Street Shark swimsuit he always wore to the public pool when we were kids. I could barely stand to look at him. Like when I saw Mr. Williams, there was this immediate sensory feeling, which felt even stronger this time. It was overwhelming. I didn't realize it during my first encounter, but when these people show up, you don't just see them, you feel them. And seeing this boy looking like he did was like walking into a candle store that smelled like your childhood bedroom. The rush was immediate. My head started spinning again. What the fuck was happening? As I tried to keep my bearings, I saw a different neighbor in her yard, tending to her garden. We made eye contact, and she extended a friendly wave. I was in no mood for small talk, so I cut right to it. I asked her if she saw these passers-by as well. "Oh yes," she said, as casually as if I had asked her about the weather. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Fuck. I had seen it and felt it twice now. And if it wasn't some collective hallucination, then this was more real than I cared to admit. As soon as I got inside, Catherine could tell something was wrong, so I spilled the beans. I told her everything, how she was right about Mr. Williams, and how I called Malcolm and what he told me. I told her the truth about the inspections, and that the other neighbors I talked to said that they could see it too. I talked until I could talk no more, and then I just looked at her, desperate for her to say something, anything. After a moment, she started nodding her head, and to my great surprise, said that she had seen people as well. She said she could have sworn she saw a childhood dog out of the corner of her eye when we toured the home. And a few days ago, she saw a woman that looked exactly like a beloved childhood nanny. While my encounters brought me panic, Catherine's brought her comfort. One thing that's important to know about Catherine is that if I'm about ones and zeros, Cat is all about ambiguity and mystery. She believed in the secret language of the universe, that people from beyond would speak to us, that signs would present themselves, so her baseline was already a little out there. Being the skeptic that I was, this is the sort of thing she and I would spar about when we were dating, but we made it work somehow. You know what they say about opposites. It sounded like her encounters were less direct than mine, which is why she took them as omens. In one sense, I was relieved that she didn't think I was crazy, that I didn't need to spend the day convincing her that I saw what I saw. But after a moment, my relief gave way to insecurity. Why didn't she tell me that she saw people? Catherine frowned. The last time she shared something she believed was a sign, I wasn't exactly comforting. A couple of years back, a monarch butterfly landed on her out of the blue, and Catherine, being the woman that she is, was convinced it was this message from her grandmother, who of course had a thing for butterflies. In no gentle fashion, I told her that I thought that was ludicrous, and ever since then she's been less than forthcoming about the things she perceived as messages from the other side. I felt a hot flash of guilt. I couldn't exactly blame her, and it's not like I told her immediately either. Husband of the year over here. The situation being what it was, we discussed our options, whether it was worth it to get the hell out of here, or if it was worth giving it a shot. For our daughter. All we wanted was to do right by Zoe. Neither Catherine nor I had great relationships with our parents, and Catherine moved around as a kid, never having a home base. We wanted everything to be solid for Zoe. It had to be. So despite these passerbys, if everything else was right, maybe this still made sense for us. Everywhere has its quirks, right? We looked each other in the eye and promised that we'd give it a shot. Once we accepted our unique situation, it started to feel normal a lot faster than I would have thought. We had between 1 and 2 encounters a week, and most of the time they were pretty low-key. It would have been exhausting if each encounter was emotionally significant. but luckily most of them were really quite mundane, and the accompanying sensation was mild. You'd be getting groceries out of the car, and suddenly you'd see your old coworker crossing the street, or the person who had the locker next to you in high school who you never really talked to, or the person you shared a bunk with in summer camp in the 8th grade, who became your best friend for 7 days and then vanished from your life completely. If it was someone random that could cross your mind, chances are they'd cross the street, but every once in a while things would get pretty interesting. Malcolm was right. It didn't seem to matter if people were living or dead. And as I soon learned, it didn't much matter if they were real or fictional either. One morning around Zoe's first birthday, I had enough energy to go for a jog. And when I opened the door, who did I see but a young Harrison Ford dressed as Indiana Jones, being chased by a dozen Peruvianatives. This was the opening scene from Raiders, of course, a movie I had seen more times than I could count. I guess as long as it was something that was rattling deep inside your head, it was fair game. Since I had already laced up my running shoes, I decided to give Malcolm's theory a test run. He said that if you chase them, eventually they disappear. So I wanted to see how far I could push it. I took off from my porch and joined the Peruvians to chase Harrison. It was exhilarating. I was out of shape, and Harrison Ford in 1981 was not. I followed the natives for a couple of blocks, eventually joining them in a full-throated holler. I had just started to gain on that handsome bastard when, in the blink of an eye, poof, Harrison and the whole tribe were gone. It was extremely disorienting. By this point, I had accepted that the encounters were real, or at the very least realish, but seeing them vanish into thin air like that really freaked me out. I put on my headphones and kept going, a million questions running through my brain. Catherine said she saw the Spice Girls in their double-decker tour bus once. Another time I saw the entire cast of a forgotten sitcom just hanging out in my neighbor's yard. But most of the time, it was people we knew. Sometimes the passers-by would echo a particular moment in your life, which always made for a good story. Like when I saw my friend Caleb wearing what he did on our lazy summer days. Since Catherine and I went to the same high school, we had a very similar pool of people in our shared past. This always made for excellent conversation. At dinners, we'd talk about the people we saw that week, what they were wearing, where in the world we were when we saw them last. In any long-term relationship, you eventually run out of things to talk about. But with these passers-by, I was learning so much about Catherine every week, hearing about her childhood friends, her dreams, the past versions of herself that she no longer was. And I was sharing more about myself too. Every week was like a different prompt. I soon realized that I was really coming around to this place. On my best days, I truly considered it a gift, but not every passerby was a barrel of laughs. One day I came home from some errands, and I found Catherine on the couch, immobile. I could tell she had been crying. She told me it was nothing, but she could barely function for the rest of the day. That night I put it together and asked her who she saw, and she told me she'd tell me later. But I knew she wouldn't, and I knew not to ask again. Not all memories are friendly ghosts. Despite my best intentions, there were encounters I didn't tell Catherine about. I saw every ex-girlfriend I ever had, every flirtation, fixation, and infatuation. Everyone I dated or tried to date. I saw these women as I knew them, which meant that they didn't look like they do now on Instagram. With their children and houses and dogs, they looked like they did in college, and even high school. They were young and beautiful. Seeing them made me uncomfortable. One Saturday, I saw my college girlfriend Monica roll up in her blue Mitsubishi Eclipse. When Monica and I were dating, we had good seasons and bad seasons. But apparently this memory was during one of the better ones. She rolled down her window and told me to get in the car, like we had somewhere to be. I didn't get in, but I talked to her for the better part of 20 minutes. It was nice, honestly. All we did was talk, but I felt like a traitor walking back into my house. There were other women too, beautiful strangers I had fallen in love with and never saw again. But the most striking run-in I had with a woman from my past was with my wife. I was confused because I thought Catherine was inside with Zoe, but I realized this is an encounter. There she was in front of me. I was seeing the Catherine I remembered from when we started dating. Physically, there wasn't much of a difference, But the longer I looked at her, the more I could see it. Her hair was a bit longer, and there was somehow more vibrance, more energy. This was still a Catherine with an air of mystery. This was still a Catherine before we had kids. Jesus, we were the kids back then. You know how you don't think someone, like Tom Cruise or Barack Obama, has aged until you see a picture of them 10 years ago. Or you think that your living room carpet hasn't faded until you see a patch that was hidden under the couch. Seeing Catherine 8 years ago was kind of like that. I went in to tell her this, excited by this observation. Needless to say, it did not go over well. I thought it was just a statement about entropy, but all she could hear was how old she must look. The more I tried to explain, the worse it got. I shouldn't have compared her to the carpet. Things eventually calmed down by the end of the night. I apologized for my lack of tact, and she eventually let it go. What is marriage, if not a commitment to see the other person? Guy told her, she asked. Indeed. That was the plan anyway. That was the plan. Catherine's heart stopped beating at 7:53 on Christmas Eve that year. I wonder if we had lived in a house with an address, if the ambulance would have been able to get there faster. I wonder if all the smoking we did in our 20s made her more likely to have an aortic aneurysm. I wonder how I would have spent those days if I'd known they were our last. These are things I will wonder and never know. I have come to learn that time eventually flattens all memories, until all you're left with is a few snapshots of any given season. The speedball of adrenaline and animal fear flattened most of my memories of that December, but what I remember of that week in perfect detail is this. I remember the Christmas song that was playing in the hospital when the doctors told me she was dead. I remember returning her presents a few days later, telling the cashiers that I had gotten the wrong size and that store credit wasn't necessary. I remember telling Zoe in the daylight, using all of the tips that the internet recommended, seeing her not understand it, and having to tell her over and over again. And I remember not crying at Catherine's funeral. You see, running into Catherine at my 5-year reunion was the first miracle of my life. But the second miracle of my life was moving to a street where I would run into her again. This wasn't goodbye. I knew she would find me. It was only a matter of time. I'll check back in shortly.